If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, outdoor people, hikers, and campers. What was your scariest terrifying encounter in the backwoods, deep forests, etc.? On October 28, 2010, at around 11 p.m. to 12:45 a.m. in the city of Newberg, Oregon, two men were walking in the woods near the Frenchview Manor when they caught a glimpse of a weird, two-legged creature running through a patch of grass to the left of the walking path. They were startled, as it was running into the dark. About 5 minutes later, 100 yards up the path, they saw this thing run by again. This time they could see that it had two skinny, dark legs, like the hind ones of a deer, forked forward at the knees. It was short, approximately waist level, and leaping or running farther up the trail. It was dark, and definitely not a person or deer. The thing made no noise, and they only saw it for a second. Then, 2 days later, while playing disc golf at Ewing Young Course on a wooded section of the course, two other men and one of the original witnesses saw a similar creature during the day. As they approached hole 10 from behind the basket, they saw the same thing. It had slick, greasy-looking black hair like that of a dog and the same forked legs at the knee. They could not see a face because a small tree blocked the view. After about 5 seconds of standing still, it hopped behind the tree, out of sight. When they went to look, it was gone. The source contacted a local pet owner who had once owned wallabies and stated that the last time he had any of them was 2 years ago. He also affirmed that he doubted that wallabies could survive in this climate during the winter. I used to hike a lot. This was maybe 2 years ago. Possibly 3. Winter is going into spring. Anyhow, there's a short wooded area nearby my grandmother's, near the docks to the river. I would go off the path to an old sewage pipe area, where I would climb onto this cinder wall and either write or just enjoy the view. I'm there for a few hours and begin to have a feeling of paranoia, as it's starting to get a tad dark at this point. Behind me, maybe to my 8 o'clock, there's a figure on the hill slightly behind me. I could only see its shadow, but it was around 6 feet 3 inches, maybe a bit taller. Closer to me, I heard something say hey in a sharp, wispy voice. I don't think I've ever taken off as fast as I did that day. This was only 3 months ago. My friend and I were hiking in the foothills near my house. The sun was just starting to go down, and we decided that it would be best to get back to the house. We were making great progress and were less than a mile from the road. The sun was no longer in the sky, and the early summer moon was illuminating our narrow path. We had just about reached the road when we heard haggard breathing around the corner. For no reason, we both crouched down and very slowly approached the sounds. Around the corner in the dip of a small valley was a gray, hairless animal slowly drinking from a pond. It had a face similar to that of a skinny dog. We very slowly creeped away and got out of the woods. I'm still afraid to go there again. Location: near Lodi, Wisconsin. Date: August 22, 1999. Time: afternoon. Michelle and a friend were hiking on a remote trail called the Ice Age Trail when she became separated from her friend and went ahead. Soon, some 50 feet away, she saw a flash of motion ahead. It was a blue-gray figure moving along the trail towards her. His first impression was that it was someone dressed in a blue jacket. Abruptly, the blue figure glided to her right, disappearing into the trees. It did not seem to be walking, it displayed a smooth gliding motion. Before it glided away, the blue figure seemed to change directions. As it turned, the witness noticed a long blue plume of something waving from behind its head. Startled, she turned to her companion, who had come up behind her. She told him what she had seen, and both went to investigate the path where it had disappeared into the bushes. Nothing was seen. Was born and raised in the hills of eastern Kentucky, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrified us both. We had been walking for about 1.5 hours when we saw a man in woman's clothes on a tree limb. That may not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the weirdest thing was that branch was roughly 20 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch, not like they had been thrown up there. I don't have to tell you what we thought we were going to catch someone doing. Anyway, we went on farther and got to a sort of flat place at the top. No trees, just grasses and flowers. Off to my left, I remember seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny black, not like the mouth of a cave, just black. Roughly 6 to 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and a bit misty around the edges. It seems like every year the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing ass off the side of that mountain. Not following the trail, just getting away from whatever that was. To this day, I think there was some connection between those clothes and what we saw. I have a few theories. My mom is a psychic medium and has always told me about her fairy hunting stories. I never really believed her and thought she was mistaking lightning bugs and fireflies for fairies. Last night, she began talking about fairy hunting again, and I decided to go with her so I could experience what my mom had talked to me about. In Lilydale, they have a fairy trail in the woods, so at around 10:30 p.m., we headed out into the woods with a flashlight. We get about half a mile into the woods, and my mom turns off all the lights and starts talking and welcoming the fairies to come in. At this point, I am sketched out and feeling super uncomfortable about being in the woods with no light. I was more expecting to see a bear than a fairy. Then, almost instantly, I feel extremely calm and start seeing these flashing lights around me. I grew up in NY, and I know what a lightning bug looks like. These were not lighting bugs. It was almost like the sparks you see when you light a lighter. Whatever was making the light was flying because you would see the light move. Then, my mom tells me to look behind me, and the tree directly behind me almost looks like it has little patches glowing in the dark. They then began to flash lights when we would sing and ask questions. I don't really know what to make out of this experience. The feeling I had was like no other. Another weird part about this that makes me believe we weren't seeing bugs was that we were asked multiple questions and asked to flash twice for yes, and every time we asked a question, we got a reply. There were about 2 minutes where we didn't see anything, and my mom asked them to show us their beautiful lights a few more times before we left, and they all started showing us their lights again. I thought I would share my experience and see what you guys might think about it. Am I a fairy believer? I might be here after last night. I live in Taylors Falls, Minnesota, and in January 2012, I was driving north on Wild Mountain Road around 7 a.m. on January 2nd. I was heading for the ski area when I saw some kind of animal running in the field towards the river. I pulled off the road and grabbed my binoculars. It looked like a large wolf, but it was different. By that time, some guy in a truck had pulled up and was wondering what I was looking at. I told him that I think there is a large wolf in the field. He got out of the truck and asked to use the binoculars. He said he didn't think it was a wolf and that it looked like it was chasing something. We stood for a few minutes, watching. It would run into the woods, then pop back into the field for a bit. The light was getting better, so I grabbed my parka and started to walk closer to get a better look. The other guy said he had to leave but did say again that he didn't think it was a wolf. I was about a half mile from the ski area, near one of the trail roads. I started to walk towards the river. I was about 100 feet from where I saw the animal from the road when I heard an owl screech coming from the woods to my right. On the edge of the woods, this huge dog came running out of the trees. The best way to describe it was that it looked like a big hyena, but it ran on 2 back legs and bent over. It had woolly, black hair all over its body and a long, thick tail. It must have weighed 200 pounds or more. I've been in the woods all my life and have never seen anything like this. It looked over at me but continued to run from right to left in front of me. It also made a steady, loud panting sound as it ran. I turned on a pivot and ran out of there, hoping this animal wasn't going to chase me. When I got to the car, an old man pulled off and stood there watching me. He wondered what I was doing. I yelled at him to get the hell out of there and said that a monster dog was out there. I think he believed me because the look on his face showed fear, like he knew something was really out there. I didn't go to the ski area. Instead, I went back home all shook up and asked myself what I saw. I read the stories about the Michigan Dogman and something you had about one being seen in Wisconsin. What do you think this was? There was no wolf or any other animal native to the area. A few years ago, I lived out in East Texas, and I had an unsettling encounter that still gives me chills to this day. My grade had a field trip out to the Mineola Nature Preserve. It is a very popular spot for people to go out and camp out and enjoy nature. One thing that should be mentioned is that it's also known for its history. Bigfoot has been spotted in the area for hundreds of years, and it is the resting place of a few Native American burial grounds. I forgot what tribe. I was walking with a group of friends, who were walking with a larger group of people, through the trails. Being teenagers, we just talked and enjoyed not doing any work and not seeing that the teacher leading the larger group had told everyone to stop and turn back. We continued on for some time before we realized that we were in the middle of the woods with no idea where we or anyone else were. We panicked, and the group decided to walk forward to see if we could see anything we could recognize. We then spotted a group of friends. We yelled with relief and asked them how they were ahead of us, but they just started running away from us. We ran after them, and when we arrived at a fork in the road, the group of friends laughed as they started to skip up the left path. We started to head to the left path when I realized I recognized the fork and that if we took the left path, it would at least take a good hour to get back to where the rest of the kids were. Me and my friends argued about which path to take before finally agreeing on my choice. As the rest of the group started walking again, I faintly heard the other group of kids, who took the left path, call my name. I was then filled with panic and dread. I realized that the group I was with was almost out of sight, and I ran back to them. After we arrived back to the rest of the kids with a very angry teacher giving us a lecture, we saw the other friends who took the left path in the woods. We asked why they didn't answer us back, but they said that they were here waiting for us to come back. We asked everyone else, and they confirmed it. I then looked at a map to see the fork, and the left path led deep into the preserve to a campsite area, which there was only one way in or out of. Could the friends I saw in the woods, which almost got me and my friends lost, have been something from Native American mythology? I have done research, but nothing has really popped up that matches the encounter. This is a story from my mother's side of the family from the early 1900s in rural eastern Ukraine, told by my great-great-grandmother. I never met her, but the tale passed from generation to generation. When my great-great-grandmother was a teenager, around 18 to 19, as I remember, she, some family, and friends went briefly traveling. I can't remember why they did that, but that's not relevant for the story. I suppose it was just a hike or to get to another town. They traveled by horse at that time, so it would take quite some time, obviously requiring camping throughout the whole thing. One night, the traveling company laid camp in a steppe near a forest and stationed their horses right by the campsite. It was quite deep into the night when my GRT grandmother was awakened by the wind noises and the rambling of the horses, which were clearly unnerved by something. Being a village girl, she knew she had to go out to check if everything was all right, and as she got out of the tent and walked towards the horses, among the low steppe vegetation, she noticed a figure. It was smaller than her and was a very hairy being with clear human traces. It was a biped, kind of resembled an old man, and had very long, hairy arms. The horses then calmed down, and it walked away as I remember, like my grandfather passed away, and it was he who told me this, and my mother isn't home right now, and I doubt she remembers this story very well, but I will update later if there is some misinformation. Growing up listening to Slavic folk tales, this didn't strike me as spooky but more as magic and mysterious in a culturally occult kind of way. If you get what I'm trying to say, my grandfather spent some time researching it, as most people from this side of my family always had a lot of interest in and sometimes connections to paranormal phenomena, but those are for other posts, maybe. Anyway, people always said it was Ulshai, protective spirit of the woods, or a domovoi, protective spirit of the household. The latter doesn't seem convincing to me since this was in the middle of nowhere, basically. My guess was that it was a Palavik. Palavik in Slavic mythology are field spirits that appear as deformed dwarfs with different colored eyes and grass instead of hair. Any European folklore always had a very particular vibe to me. It was always mysterious yet blissful. Plus, how do you see those beings? Like literal nature creations? Ancient humanoids? Fey energy spirits? An experience I had in the Austrian Alps last week on vacation. I was on a solo trip, and on the first day there, I decided to hit the trails right away. I picked one that had a prominent stream on its route, which ended with a spectacular waterfall area. I passed the village at the foot of the forest and mountain, along with a few farms and wood processing spots. I encountered only a handful of other hikers near this area, and about a mile in, I stopped seeing anyone else in front of or behind me. I stayed on the route that hugged the stream, and it proved to be quite scenic. I stopped a few times along the way just to take in the beauty and serenity. Further on, I came to a point where the stream met a smaller tributary one that fed into it and had a beautiful rock formation as they adjoined. I decided to take a panoramic photo at this point, as I had done it a few times already on the hike. I take the pano and make sure the final version is aligned, not warped, and that I don't have to make a redo. Satisfied, I return to camera mode and pan to the left with my phone. Now here is where it gets interesting. As I am panning in that direction with the rocks in view, going across to the right is a completely white figure with solid, long legs and moving at a brisk pace along the rocks. I get chills as my mind tries to register what it just saw. I look up at the rocks themselves, and there's nothing there, luckily. Now normally I wouldn't think much of it, but something about it just freaked me out the further I went into the forest. My mind kept playing it back, and I couldn't come to grips with how something could be moving in front of the rocks in the opposite direction of my panning. I decided to head back at this point after traveling about another half-mile. I never knew of anything of this sort. I've heard of wood elves and fairies, ghosts, spirits, etc., but nothing solid white like this. This story is not my own, but of my uncle's. My uncle lives in West Virginia, one of the more remote states in the eastern United States. While his main house is in town, he also has a small cabin up on Spruce Knob, where he and my aunt would go during the summers. This cabin is very remote, accessed only by jeep trails, and isn't connected to the electrical grid. So my aunt and uncle decided to take advantage of a 3-day weekend sometime in the late 1980s and headed out to the cabin for some fly fishing and relaxation in the woods. When they arrived, my aunt went out to sketch some, while my uncle unpacked and built a fire in the fireplace, as it was already getting dark. As night began to fall, my uncle noted how unusually quiet the woods were. He has been camping, canoeing, and backpacking all over the world, and he still says that this is the quietest time he has even heard of them. He and my aunt packed everything up and went to bed late, sometime around midnight. My uncle awoke to a strange thumping and scratching noise coming from outside. He thought it was probably a bear or coyote trying to get at the dog and grabbed his .444 Marlin, go deal with it. As he pulled the gun out of its case, the door on the outside swung open, and a large, hairy, vaguely humanoid shape appeared silhouetted in the moonlight. He said he never quite got a good look at it, but the one thing he really remembers is the overpowering smell, a stench of decay, and 2 glowing red or yellow eyes. He quickly emptied the .444, and while he didn't get a kill shot, he did scratch the beast's arm, which caused it to run squealing into the woods. He and my aunt immediately grabbed their things, got in their Bronco, and hightailed it out of there. Whatever my uncle saw never really bothered them again, and when he returned in the morning with more people and firepower, he found little evidence of any intrusion, except for a single strange clawed footprint in front of the cabin and claw marks on the door. I don't really know whether to believe my uncle or not, as he is known for telling tall tales. However, unlike his other stories, he was completely serious when he told this one, and my aunt backed him up. This story has always deeply disturbed me, as I too spend a lot of time in the woods. I will be making a trip up to their cabin this summer, so maybe I will see this strange beast too. I was visiting Lithuania once. Sure, it's a poor country, but it does have a lot to offer. I don't remember the name of the town, but I do remember that it was about 7 years ago. I was going for a hike. It was already very dark at that point. The town itself had very low ground and very high ground, and I was pretty much going to the top. With that angle, I was able to see the whole town, but that's not the only thing I saw. There were 3 big lights hovering above the town in a perfect horizontal line, with not a very big space between them. I got to look at them for about an hour. They were not moving and were quite far away, though they still seemed big enough no matter what the distance was. The color of the light was white, but in a tinted range. Eventually all 3 lights vanished with a blink of an eye, and to this day, I have no idea what it was exactly. So about a couple years ago, I was hanging out with some of my buddies. It was me, my right-hand man, and 2 chicks. We were bored one night, around midnight or so, and wanted to do something fun or interesting. Someone suggested a night hike. And I instantly thought of that place, so I told them where it was, and we all headed out there. By the time we get there, it's about 1 a.m., and it's pitch black. Keep in mind there are no lights out there at all. Luckily for us, the moon was out just the littlest bit. It doesn't help that the trees block it out, though. So I'm leading the pack since I know the trail. I'm using my phone for the flashlight, and my buddy is in the back with his phone light. We're about 20 minutes into the hike, and we're pretty far up already. The girls wanted a water break, so we stopped for a second. As soon as we start walking up the trail again, I start to hear something in the bushes ahead of us. I continued to walk and raised my light as high as I could. Then, from about 30 to 40 feet away, I see this thing hunched over, hiding behind a bush. I couldn't make out what it was, but it looked pale white and somewhat large. At first, I thought it could have been a deer or something. But then I saw what looked like a human head, and it was bald. I instantly stopped because it looked as if it were hiding from me and the light. Everyone behind me stops, too. I say, "What is that?" And, quicker than I could see it, it runs off into the trees. I usually never get scared of anything, but right then, I felt my blood run cold. There was no way that was an animal. The way it moved, it wasn't right. It never made a sound, either. So everyone was freaking out, but we were already so far up that we decided to keep pressing forward. I always used to carry a blade with me, so I pulled it out. Nothing really happened on the way up. We got to the top and chilled out for a while. But the whole way up, I felt like someone was with us. Like in between the trees. It was an uneasy feeling, I can't explain it. We started heading back down, and as we turned one of the first turns back down, I saw a figure on the trail in the distance. I quickly turned my light towards it, but it jumped right into the bushes next to the trail. I pull out my blade again and tell everyone to get behind my buddy and me. We were about 20 feet away from this bush and couldn't see anything beyond it with our lights on it. But it was still moving behind the bushes, and it made kind of a faint grunting noise. With my knife in my hand, I remember I yelled, Whoever's in there needs to get the duck out now or I'll straight stab a mother ducker. I'm not kidding, and it stopped moving, but I remember hearing heavy breathing. It sounds like something big, that's what scared me the most. I had a feeling it was that thing again. I feel like it followed us up there. We slowly got the nerve to start down the trail again, and as soon as we were far enough, we booked it. We still had a ways down, but I swear I never went down a mountain so fast in my life. We were all sliding down at one point. Once we all got the cars, we all talked about what had happened and concluded there was no way it was an animal. It would have run off or made itself known. This thing was hiding. It freaks me out to think about it. I still haven't been back there. Silver City has an area called Boston Hill, which is mostly wild terrain and has a few old mining pits from back in the day. When I was younger, 16, I used to run the trails with my dog Irpa, as it was right above my home. We would usually run at dusk because it was only about a 30-minute jog. The trail I ran was one big circle, and it was much cooler in the evening. Irpa is an amazing dog and is incredibly protective of me, especially when we go running together. She knew the trails almost better than I did. On this particular run, all was well until about a quarter of the way through the run. I had a bit of an uneasy feeling, as if we were being watched, but I brushed it off. However, Irpa had been incredibly jumpy and did not want to go up the trail, which was very uncharacteristic as she loved to run around. I decided to keep jogging, but Irpa refused to budge. On a typical run, she would sometimes stop to stiffen things. I would run on without her, and as soon as she saw me getting ahead, she would bolt after me. On this run, however, she was stopped dead in her tracks, just staring up the hill, and would not move. I figured she must have been listening to something and would just catch up to me as she usually did. About 3/4 up the trail, I realized that Irpa was still nowhere to be seen. I stopped and waited for her for about 5 minutes, and as I waited, the feeling of something watching me became even stronger. The trails were surrounded by incredibly tall grass. I'm 5'2" and they were about head height, and I realized that the patch of grass in front of me seemed to have a dark mass in it, like a dark shadow of sorts, which kept the grass from swaying like the areas around it. Completely creeping out, I decided to wait for Irpa at the beginning of the trail where we started. As I began to run again, I realized that the mass was running next to me in the grass. I looked over and could definitely tell that the grass was moving with whatever it was, and it was definitely much larger than a rabbit or a coyote. The grass was moving in an odd way in tandem, like it would if a person were running through it, all the way up the blade, as opposed to quaking slightly, like it would if it were a smaller animal running at a low level. The thing about New Mexico wild grass, though, is that it's not thick. If a human had been running next to me, I would still have been able to see at least part of their clothing or skin, yet when I looked, there was nothing except a dark shape. I sped up my pace and tried to keep my eyes on the trail. The mass next to me sped up as well. I felt absolutely overwhelmed with fear and just kept running. I tried my hardest to keep from looking next to me, but I swore it seemed like the thing was much darker now, like the shadow had become thicker and had more substance to it. It felt like whatever it was trying to reach me, but I still wanted to stay hidden. I finally reached the beginning of the trail again, which opened into a wider area. The mass stopped right where the trail began to open up and stayed perfectly still. I waited for Irpa for about a minute, then ran the rest of the way home. Irpa was waiting for me at the front door and was whining for me to let her in. She had never gone home without me before, and she never has since. It took a few weeks to get enough courage to go back up there, and when I did, I took all 4 of our dogs. This time, everything felt normal, and they ran around as per usual. Over the next few months, there were times I did feel that same uneasiness again, but I never directly saw or heard the mass again. A note, to describe the mass, it was a little shorter than I was and was not solid. It was almost like a shadow in a way. Me and some friends were camping in a place called Caron Valley. As soon as we pulled up the tracks, we all started seeing these spirals of color in front of us, almost like light trails. All 3 of us were a bit spooked but didn't think anything of it. That night we had a campfire and decided to get an early night. We were all completely sober. I was trying to sleep in the camper van, and we had left the door open, maybe a foot for some fresh air, when suddenly I saw a red and green light almost dancing with each other and could hear giggles and chatting. I was frozen in a slight shock and fear as I genuinely felt like I was going insane, and I tried to call out to my friend to tell her I could see fairies. The next thing I know, I can see basically a whole lot of things. There are druids, elves, things about foot tall, and even pixies on mini horses. I know it sounds utterly unbelievable and true. If someone told me this, I would think they were high, but I was 100% sober. I lay there watching this for about an hour. You're frozen in shock, yes, fear. At one point, The pixies were throwing stones at Mr. through the gap in the door. I finally plucked up the courage to turn around and face the other way when I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night and experienced the most realistic déjà vu ever. I'd literally lived through that before. The next morning, my two friends both shared that they had a dream that this place was where the motherlode entrance was. I feel weird typing this out, as it's something very personal and private to me that I've only shared with my mother and probably won't share with many people. Looking back, I wish I could have enjoyed this, but it wasn't a good experience for me. It was bad energy, and we were not welcome on that land, I don't think. So, this happened when I was about 13 in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I stopped telling this story a long time ago since no one would believe me. Me and a friend were bored one day, so we thought it would be good fun to grab a few heavy branches and try to clear a trail through the brambles in the woods that bordered our neighborhood. These woods were near impenetrable with various thorny bushes, and even after a few hours, we barely managed to clear past his property and into the woods proper. We managed to clear a narrow, winding trail that we could walk through while only maintaining minor cuts and scratches. Eventually we stumbled onto a clearing in the midst of brambles and thorny vines that, with the dense tree coverage, formed walls taller than we were. There in the clearing, about 6 feet in front of us, arching between 3 larger bushes, the vines had managed to form a cave of sorts. Underneath the natural cover sat 2 animals that I have never managed to identify. They looked to be a cross between foxes and deer, with the size leaning closer to the latter. One had amber-colored eyes, and the other was green. Both sets of eyes were incredibly bright, almost shining. After we both entered the clearing and saw the animals, it felt like time stopped for a moment. This is where it gets a little strange. I remember making eye contact with the green-eyed creature and seeing and feeling the most peculiar emotions. The animal had what I can only describe as a great but wild sort of intelligence behind its eyes. Its gaze felt like it was judging me. I felt inadequate, like my very presence was inappropriate. And just like that, the creatures darted past us with incredible speed. I've never seen anything, animal or man-made, move as fast as they did, from sitting to gone in an instant. If I hadn't been staring, I fully think I could have blinked and simply assumed they had disappeared or were illusions. Well, that's my small and only encounter with the unexplained. This happened around 1920 to 1930. My late great-grandfather, for the rest of the story, he will be referred to as GGF, was in Tennessee hunting for raccoons at night with his buddy. He was armed with a double barrel, and his buddy had a .22. With them were 2 dogs. They were deep into a trail along a fence when they heard a crunch above them, thank God. They looked up to see a large black animal about 7 feet long with a tail. I watched them from the tree, silent. My GGF's buddy fired a single shot at the creature, and it completely tanked it, jumped down about 15 feet, and went berserk. My GG said it had jaws like a dog, and it was strong enough to lift a 40-pound dog off the ground and kill it with a chomp. A 12-gauge round to the shoulder slows it down, but not for long. It swipes the other dog, killing it almost instantly. GGF's friend tries to run, but the animal swipes at him, hardly nicking his back and tearing his shirt half off his body. GGF fires his last shot into the animal's stomach and throws down his gun. The animal has most of his attention on his buddy, who is holding a lantern out in front of him and is growling like nothing he's heard before. My girlfriend takes this chance to yank a fence post out of the ground and beat the animal. He clubs it over the head and spine, killing it with a few strong hits. It whimpered like a dog. After better examination, they described the animal as having a big wolf head, big old paws with claws like a bear, and a skinny but strong body. It also has long black hair and a long tail like a puma's. They abandon the hunt and gut the animal so they can drag the body about 2 miles back to the cabin my GGF lived in. This is when the story gets weird. Apparently they take it to a guy with a scientific background in zoology, biology, or something. The man eventually gets back to them, telling them to stay out of the forest at night, with no explanation of what the animal was. When I was 12, me and my friends went to a summer camp together. We are from Michigan, and there was a lot of talk about this transparent creature, so we wanted to hunt it. Our counselor actually took us here, telling us things about it, including how tall it was and our last sightings. Apparently the transparent creature was made up, but this was a different thing. Together, we walked about the summer camp. It was pitch black outside and around 12 a.m. it's just me, 3 friends, and a camp counselor. Another member of staff also came with us. We had been walking around the camp for about 15 minutes when we came to the open field we used for games and such, called the ball pit. That's when we heard a small crack in the tree line surrounding the ball pit, more specifically towards the area where archery was set up. We moved closer together, More small cracks followed when we had come close, probably 15 feet away from the trees. We then heard a large crack, which sounded like a large log had just been stepped on, and we flashed our lights at it. I had the best view of it, and what I saw was what looked like an 11-foot tall creature, so pale the moonlight shone as if its face was distorted, or maybe not, but I still didn't get the best view. It had a broken horn on one side and a non-broken one on the other. It was a slave squatting on a brush pile. It has looked so hungry that I could see all of its ribs. This happened a long time ago. I was 12 and in my grandparents' village. We had a cow and an ox. Usually the son of the bull, usually just one, took all the cattle to graze, and at night he would take them back. Cows know where to go when going home. My grandpa had a male ox, and since my father was an adult and he wasn't there, I took the responsibility. Basically, my job was to go around the village with the ox trailing after I called the people to open their doors. Our ox would grunt to call the herd, and all the females came out. From then on, I had to take them to a clearing up the mountain and then later take them to the river. It was easy. The animals already knew where they were going. They were calm, and our bull was a gentle giant. All I did was ride him and have a thin rope on his horns. If any of the females wandered off, all I did was call or, on rare occasions, poke her with a dull stick in the right direction. My grandpa said that if I see a wold, very rare, a boar, or a fox, I should stay on the ox. Not many animals dare go near an ox herd. There is a dark part of the forest where it is very quiet, and even the bravest hunters won't go. It is very slippery and dangerous. They said that even the deer and boar dare not go there. I was forbidden to go there, and honestly, I never wanted to. It was an early morning, and everything seemed fine. I was on the ox, going up the mountain. I was glad he let me, because it was a hard trek up. I saw that one of the females was wandering off. I followed her and left our ox and the dogs to guide the herd. She went into the forest. I ran to her and got started tying the rope to her horns. I tried steering her away, but she continued. She went into the dark part and stopped. I didn't want to get off in case she ran back and left me there. I heard a crunch and turned. A very old man was walking towards us. He looked frail, with dirty clothes and a long beard. I was scared, so I laid on the ox, clinging to her, not wanting to fall if she ran. Oxen aren't like bulls. They don't jump or kick when scared. They either attack with their horns and trample or run. I was ready to hold on, no matter what she chose. Our oxen didn't take kindly to strangers before I took them out. I had to go to every house and have the ox owner introduce me to the animal. That way, they saw that their owner trusts me and their herd leader, our ox, trusts me. I knew she would either attack or bolt. But she just stood there. The stranger came to us and petted her on the head, whispering something I didn't understand. He looked at me. His eyes were completely white. Then he turned around and left. He just disappeared in the trees. Suddenly, the female grunted as if she had just woken up. Our male makes that noise every morning, and bolted the way we came from. We found the herd. I quickly got on our ox and yelled water. He knew that command and went down towards the river. There were houses there, and it was closer than home. I barged into one of the houses and tried to explain. The couple there stayed with me and sent their daughter to call my grandpa. I couldn't sleep for days, remembering those white eyes. My grandparents didn't let me out of the house for the garden, and I wasn't allowed near trees. Later, I learned they were protecting me from a lesbian. A forest spirit can take the form of a man, an owl, or a wolf. It hurts when people go into his part of the woods and can kidnap you. I later learned that the ox that took me there had fallen ill and died. It sometimes stays in the trees as an owl, looking for the offender. For years, when I went to my grandparents, they wouldn't let me be alone. Not just outside but inside too. I am never going into these woods again. Two young kids, around 10 and 12 years of age, and their grandfather are going on a hunting trip in the winter in Alberta. They are going to a frozen lake just outside one of the large swaths of land that make up this region. They know the area has had some strange occurrences, as their grandfather has said on the previous trips they've had. However, no one in their family has had any encounters in this area. As they are hiking in, they notice that no one is around, and the forest on both sides is really quiet. They get to their main camp, where their grandfather says to set up their base camp, and start cooking dinner. It's around 5 p.m., and it'll be dark around 7 or so. After dinner, the 12-year-old boy noticed two large white wolves around the edge of the frozen lake on the other side. The grandfather takes a quick breath and gets his binoculars. The wolves are much, much larger than they should be, and this scares the young boys. Then they see what looks to be an 8-9 foot tall being with extremely skinny legs and wearing bare skin. The being is standing with the bare head over his head and face, obscuring anyone from making out his true form. Now and then, he lifts his head up to reveal deep blue eyes that are almost glowing. They can see them from 150 yards away, looking like sapphires in the evening light. The grandfather rushes his two boys to the center of the lake on a rock outcropping with some space in the middle, being very careful not to break the ice. They go one at a time. From his perspective, there is no way the two huge wolves and their tall owner could make it out on the frozen lake. He figures if they do try to come out to them, he will shoot the ice with his shotgun so they will sink. As nightfall comes, the wolves start howling, and they can see that the being's eyes glow blue in the dark. They start pacing and testing the ice, but they are too cautious to make a dash across the frozen ice to them. They seem almost content to harass and annoy them from the edges of the lake. Around 11 p.m. or so, the two wolves disappear back into the forest. This makes the grandfather nervous, but he tried not to show it. The grandfather is trying to keep his boys' minds off the beings, and they started a small fire that they huddled around all night. The grandfather does not sleep and watches over his grandchildren. They did not have all of their gear and no tent, as they brought only the basics out to the rock island. He did bring some tools and enough wood to start a fire. The next day, they get up extremely early and head back to their car. The forest is dead silent at 5 a.m. on a winter day. About halfway back, they hear rustling in the bushes and see the two large wolves trailing them on either side of the forest. The grandfather fires a few warning shots with his shotgun, and they drop off and stay back a bit. Both boys are also armed with a shotgun and a rifle, and the grandfather tells them to shoot anything that charges at them. About 5 minutes later, the unthinkable happens. A white moose appears between all three of them, as they were in a triangle-like formation. This moose crashes through the middle and into the grandfather, who shoots his shotgun again. It's chaos, and they hear the wolves howling. The grandfather is caught underneath the moose's hooves and is trampled, and he's badly hurt. The moose then runs off towards the wolves and back into the forest. The boys help their grandfather back up, and he seems to be hurt but able to move. They slowly make their way back to their car and get out of there. They didn't go hunting anymore after this. The grandfather told the boys on the way home that he saw the moose as it appeared in front of them. It was facing him. As it came towards him, he noticed its eyes, and they were bright blue, just like the ones that had been staring at them during the night. The grandfather ended up having a broken rib, several bruises and contusions, and a fractured wrist, but otherwise fared well for an encounter with a deadly animal such as a moose. Later on, he talks with his friend, who suggests that all three beings were possibly skinwalkers. The friend said it was odd that they were all white or took white fur on. It's definitely not a coincidence that the two wolves show back up and then the tall moose shows up out of nowhere, with blue eyes just like the tall being had. There is a mountain that I live near that I collect stones on, here in Oregon. Quartz crystals, tourmaline, gold, you name it. It's an old mining area that has abandoned mine shafts and dilapidated old buildings from the 1800s. The roads up this mountain are treacherous, taking quite a while to get up if you accidentally take the wrong, unmaintained, roads. One day, my roommate and I decided to go collect stones up there. It was spring, and the weather was great. We hadn't seen signs of other people all day. It was a quiet day in the national forest, as kids were still in school. We made it up the mountain and set up camp. We poked around the area, finding a few crystals here and there, and even though I had been up this mountain many times, something felt off this time. This crude camping area with its makeshift toilet was extremely remote, but I had never felt strange there before. It's as if we were being watched. That feeling you get in your subconscious that you cannot seem to shake. But I did, and we carried on with our day. At around 9 p.m., after preparing a fire and some food, we decided to head to bed. The tent was about 50 feet from the car, and that made me feel comfortable. I had just about fallen asleep, and my roommate was already out like a light when the noise caught my attention. It sounded like the brush just in the tree line shaking. We were surrounded by forest all around except for a boulder field to the back of our tent up against a massive mountain peak with an amazing rock face. I sat there, listening to the bushes shake, wondering what could be out there. It's not unusual to have elk or small animals like opossums come into camp and walk through, but this was something big. What happened next made my blood run cold. I hear the bushes stop shaking, and something takes a step onto the ground. It had a loud step. I know that sounds strange, but that's the best way to describe it. It then proceeds to walk right up to the tent. What made me lose my cool mentally was that it was on two legs. I could identify right away that this was not a four-legged group coming around camp. I laid there as still as I could and listened. All I could hear was heavy breathing. Then it all went quiet. Again, I hear the bushes rattle, and it walks up to the tent again. The bizarre part is that I never heard it walk back away from the tent. That messed with my head. After a few minutes of silence had passed, I jammed my roommate in the ribs with my elbow and whispered, as uncomfortable as making a noise made me feel, for him to listen. Just be quiet and listen. After a few minutes of him looking at me like I had lost my mind, the bushes shook, and whatever it was, he walked up to the tent again. My roommate's eyes got big, and he whispered, "Oh my God, that's 2 feet." He knew how I felt by the look on my face and didn't even expect a response. We sat there for a good 20 minutes, listening to this thing walk up to the tent over and over but never walk away. Then, whatever it was, I walked over to the crude bathroom and started shaking it violently. Both of us are now lying up in our sleeping bags, debating in our minds what to do next. After a good 45 minutes of all of this going on, everything got silent, so we sat there for about another 20 minutes, still in silence. That's when I turned to my roommate and said, "We need to go." All we had for defense was a small axe in the tent with us, which, looking back, was so very foolish. I grabbed the axe, and I said we're going to book it to the car, get in, and lock the doors. And we did just that. We ripped the tent zipper down the fastest we could without getting it closed, and we hightailed it right for the car. My roommate turned the car on immediately and turned the headlights on, illuminating the entire camping area without a tent in front of the car. Nothing. There are no signs of anything in our limited visual field. My roommate jumps out of the car, runs up and grabs the tent with everything in it, runs back and throws it all on the back seat, and we take off down the mountain in the pitch black. The entire time, I'm expecting whatever that thing was to come running out of the car. I have camped up in this area for a few good times, and, as I kid you not, it is one of the most beautiful, pristine subalpine areas you will ever see. The natives used to call this area Skookum Mountain and said it was haunted by the evil god of the woods. The miners had a rough time here. Rugged country filled with many perils, the area around Skookum Mountain. Skookum is a native word for Bigfoot. Near my house, there's a massive 2,000+ acre area that once was home to a military production plant for TNT. It's now home to a car manufacturing plant and a nature reserve. Most of this 2,000 acre area is dense forest, and winding through the forest, there are several dirt trails. There's also an old, overgrown cemetery hidden in the forest. Some of its graves hold babies, and a few are unmarked. Possibly the graves of slaves, which wouldn't surprise me as I live in the southern USA and the cemetery could easily be over 200 years old. Well, it was maybe a month after graduating from high school, and 3 of my friends were spending the night at my place. We decided it would be a good idea to take a midnight hike into the forest on these trails, and I had hiked on these trails before during the day. We didn't know what was apparently waiting for us. It was around 9 p.m., I suppose, and we started getting ready for our hiking adventure. I took my backpack from high school and gladly emptied out my remaining notes and paperback workbooks and filled it with snacks, quite a few water bottles, a machete, you never know when you'll need one in the woods, and a few flashlights. In addition to the flashlights, I was carrying a massive spotlight that I had bought specifically for exploring in the woods at night. It was just my friends James, Dustin, Richard, and myself. We were all geared up, and so we set out on our adventure. To get to the trails, you have to walk through maybe a mile of neighborhood roads. We were all 18 at the time, so legal curfew was no concern to us. However, having a machete in my backpack made me understandably nervous about possibly getting caught. We finally reached the trails after a 20-minute walk through the neighborhoods, and all the while we were chatting about girls, games, and typical stuff. It only took about 15 or 20 minutes on the trails for us to run into whatever was waiting there. Our destination was originally the cemetery, which is maybe an hour's hike into the woods, so we didn't get far at all. We were casually hiking when we came to a hill. My friend Richard stops and says he needs to rest, saying he feels like his energy is drained. He's not a very physically fit guy, so we understood. I handed him a snack and a water bottle, and we just relaxed at the bottom of the large hill for 5 minutes. Suddenly, my friend Dustin says he saw something at the top of the hill, almost like somebody hiding in the bushes that are up there. He and James decided to go check it out, taking the spotlight and the machete with them. I volunteered to stay behind with Richard. After 5 minutes of them investigating, they came tearing down the hill, screaming about something. I nervously asked them what the hell was going on, and they replied, there was something in the bushes, but when we got up there, it had already moved away. The way they described it, it was a pitch black shadow with a single, golden eye that remained in the shadows or bushes, never coming out. They also said that if they tried to get near it, it would almost teleport into a further away shadow or bush. The look on their faces told me that it was no joke, so we got the hell out of there and rushed our way towards the neighborhood, all the while this thing was following us. However, The way it would follow us and move away if we got closer was almost as if it were asking us to follow it. Maybe it needed help, who knows? We were too scared to find out what it wanted. We finally made it back to the neighborhood and were nearly running home. The thing is still following us. Out of nowhere, I'm hit with emotions that I could only describe as extreme sorrow, and I feel tears forming in my eyes. I blinked them away and notified my friends of the feelings that overcame me. We were about halfway home when James and Dustin said, "There's two of them. We just saw one in front of us." This scared me even more, so we began walking faster and faster. We were just about to pass the deck of one of the houses when James stopped in his tracks, wearing a terrified mask where his face used to be. He says, "Something black just flashed in front of my face for a second or two and completely blocked everything out." We continued, going faster and faster. The two entities seemed to stop following us as we were about 3/4 there. What followed us then was a massive, black, ominous mist of some sort that seemed to always be behind us, blocking any light behind it. We stopped, held hands, and said a quick prayer. The black mist seemed to weaken a little, eventually disappearing as we passed a church that's right up the road from my house. The two black figures scared me, but I didn't feel threatened by them. The black mist, however, made me feel as if I were its prey. A few months later, it was just Dustin and me. We decided to go hiking during the day, of course. Everything was completely normal, for the majority of the time. When we took a rest break about halfway to the cemetery, Dustin put his hat down on the ground, top up. We continued on, but he forgot about his hat. We were finally returning from the cemetery when I realized he had forgotten his hat and that it wasn't where he left it. We just continued on because he said he could get another. Halfway between where we rested this time and where Dustin and James originally saw the black figure, we found his hat. In the middle of the trail, upside down. The hat wasn't crumpled like someone had dropped it, it was almost as if someone picked it up, turned it upside down, and gently placed it on the ground. Okay, let me backstory this by saying I've seen this cloaked figure many times in my life. It's always far between, though. Like years between sightings. Last night I went out to look for our dogs at midnight, shaking their food bowls and whistling for them. They had gone out and not come back. We live on 4 acres of farmland, so it's not huge but a good size, but we do live in the Appalachian Mountains, and we are right at the base of the woods. We also have that gigantic cemetery, 500 plots with a lot of unmarked graves or just marked with a rock, behind our house. I got all the way to the other edge of our property from our house. On the other side of the property, I turned around, and the black cloaked figure was standing on the cemetery. It looked 6 feet, sort of levitated, so it's not a person, and entirely black. I stand there and stare for a second to make sure it is what I see. I don't want to freak out for any reason. It moves its robed arm, and I immediately take off, running to our house, and all I can smell is rotting flesh. It smells like there's something dead and rotting right in front of me, or like I'm running towards something dead. I didn't smell it while I walked there, and I ran the exact same path I walked. It took my husband a half hour to calm me down, and I was hyperventilating. I had explained to him that I had seen this figure before while we were dating, but that was over texts, and he didn't get the full experience. This was the first time he had ever seen me in person after seeing this particular thing. Entity? Ghost? Demon? He's seen me after I've dealt with other things, but this was new for him. My dogs showed up on our porch 30 minutes later with their tails between their legs. They both looked terrified. I think the presence was holding my dogs to lure me. This story was told to me by my father, my uncle, and my aunt. They revisited discussing it many times during my life. I think it would be good to share it. During this time, they lived in an apartment in the Midwest. The apartments at that time and in that particular building were built in a long line, 1-room entrance, a dining area, a bathroom, followed by bedrooms. These were referred to as railcar apartments due to the room-to-room connecting design. There was a young couple that lived in the adjoining railcar apartment who had gone out for the afternoon. My curious father and his siblings decided to peek through the windows for fun. The ceilings were high, as were the long, narrow windows. As my nosy relatives looked in the windows, they noticed that the young couple had left the light on in their bedroom. A long, slim black shape was seated at the dressing table as though looking at itself in the mirror. The shape was devoid of features and appeared as a wide piece of clothing with no depth whatsoever. It did, however, seem to have a head and narrow shoulders. They looked in again, and the entity was lying across the bed, the lower portion draping towards the floor. They became a bit terrified at this point, but my uncle, being the oldest, had my dad and my aunt lift him up to stand on the windowsill so that he could see everything. What happened next gives me chills to this day. The long, trailing shape was on the inside and slowly ascended to the height of my uncle's face. It paused there, pitch black and seemingly facing him. He mentioned that it had a sparkly black turban-type affair on its head. He screamed with horror and fell from the window ledge to the ground. Before they all ran away, the entity passed the window slowly as though it were on roller skates and had a distinct profile of a cat or small toddler. Interpretations vary with the three tellers of the story. It was at this point that the young couple inhabiting the apartment came home. My dad and his siblings tried to warn them of what happened. The couple invited them in, and they went from room to room to prove to the kids that nothing was there. What it was, no one knows. I never would have been brave enough to enter the apartment after seeing something like that. I am now 28 years old and residing in Georgia, but at the time of the story, I was about 13 in South Mississippi, where this took place. So many years ago, my parents got divorced. When my parents split, my dad moved in with my grandmother and my younger brother in Mississippi. My mom had moved across the state line to Alabama. No more than 40 miles apart. I decided to move in with my mom, but I visited my dad every weekend because they agreed upon joint custody. Where my dad and my grandmother lived, that road had a lot of relatives of ours living down the road. Now, from the beginning of the road to the end, it is honestly about 15 or 20 miles, but our relatives lived starting with us at the beginning, and the last relative of our family lived about 2 miles deep on that same road. For pretty much the first 2 miles of this road, I knew it and had family on either side. So I got to my dad's house Saturday morning, hung out for about 30 minutes, and decided to call up my cousin. Mind you, summer is transitioning to autumn. Of course, he's home, so I get permission and start my trek. As I start walking, the clouds get gray, and it begins to drizzle or sprinkle. I'm not too worried about it because I'm halfway there already, and my clothes shouldn't get soaked due to this. As I pass a relative's home and before I get to my cousin's, there's this long curve that swings right. Once directly in the center of this curve, there are nothing but trees and dense brush on both sides, with no houses in sight. Again, in the center, to your left before the brush thickens, there's a small patch of grass about 3 to 4 feet high. I'm walking and getting to this curve, and as I get to the center of the curve, the rain gets a bit heavier. As the rain hits the pavement, I tighten my shirt collar around my neck to help keep it dry. As I'm doing so, I start hearing rustling in the small patch of grass to my left. Thinking it just could be a deer, I turn left and see it. It was a big, tall, humanoid-like creature. It had its backs to me, walking oddly or slowly into the woods. It was about 7 feet tall and approximately 30 feet away from me. I ducking froze. I just stared at it. It was completely engulfed with black hair, and down its back on the left and right sides, there was a thin white vertical line running down both sides. Now this is going to sound stupid, but it looked like a 7-foot tall, 2-legged skunk with no tail. As soon as it got to the wood line, I booked it. I remember running on the center yellow lines of the road to make my escape more quiet, and the rain helped with that as well. As I escaped the curve and it straightened out, I could see my cousin's place, and I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I tried to tell my cousin about it and my family, but everyone just wrote me off. I mean, I was only 13 and have no proof. Phones nowadays didn't exist during this time, and if they did, we couldn't afford them. So no one believed me. I never walked down that road again. Now that I'm older and moved out of state, about twice a year I go down and visit some family around that very road, and every time I pass that curve, I look to see if I can see it again. So me and my boyfriend were staying at my grandma's house for about a week. We both like late night waking, so I decided to take him out on one and show him what it's like at my grandma. He's used to the city, and my grandma is very in the middle of nowhere. We ended up waking up in a direction I never go, and we had walked for a good few minutes before we hit a field clearing on either side of the road. We were talking when, all of a sudden, we heard coyotes towards the back part of the field or mountains. I told him they moved fast and that we should turn back and quickly get back to our houses. We did, but it seemed that the moment we turned to walk back, they began to close in. Within a matter of seconds, they seemed to be right behind us and closing the distance fast. We began to panic and power walk or jog because they sounded like they were in a frenzy. After a minute or two of fear and adrenaline, the sound died to an almost silent silence. Almost home, a dog ran out in front of us, wanting attention. However, as soon as I went to pet him, he seemed to notice something and immediately positioned himself behind us, towards the coyote area we just left, and began barking and growling. We took it as our cue and booked it the rest of the way home with his frantic barks in the background. When we made it back, my boyfriend wanted to sit on the steps to see if they had tracked us all the way back. We sat for a moment before everything went silent. All of a sudden, a low, deep growling noise filled the air. It was everywhere all at once, like a jet taking off. It began to get louder as an ice-cold chill ran straight down my back. We both looked at each other for a second before I spoke up and told him something wasn't right and we needed to go now. We darted into the house and locked the doors. We were done exploring for the night. The coyotes are normal for our area and were on their normal trail, but what made them go silent and stop tracking us? What was the dog so frantic about? What was that sound? I've attended and now work seasonally at a summer camp in northern Michigan for several years, and since it is quite old with almost all of the buildings in the original condition in which they were constructed, of course there are rumors that the entire place is haunted. Most of them can be chalked up to counselors just trying to scare their kids, but there have been more than a few unexplained incidents reported by the staff members who know better than to do that. I think that I may have had one of these paranormal encounters there this summer. It was around midnight during staff training before we had campers to look after, and I was sitting alone on a bench in front of the lake talking with my girlfriend on the phone. We're chatting, and she makes a joke about one of our friends, don't remember the specifics, and I let out a barely audible chuckle. Suddenly, she asks me who else is there listening to our conversation. I tell her that I'm the only person here, but she tells me that she heard a deep-throated laughter come over the phone that definitely wasn't my voice. I start getting a couple of chills, and the hair on the back of my neck starts to raise, but I tell her it was probably just cell phone signal interference. Just at that moment, though, I hear a noise on the ground, not 2 feet in front of me, as if a rock had been displaced or someone had gotten up from the bench and walked towards the beach. Nobody else was in sight, and I saw no wildlife in the area. Needless to say, I got the heck out of there. It's a great camp that truly means a lot to me, and I'll still keep coming back year after year, but at times the place can just be downright creepy. Many years ago, I was dating a guy who was really into camping and hiking, as am I. We spent a lot of time camping in primitive sites, which I prefer to car camping. He wanted to take me to visit his dear friends who lived in Kentucky. They have 150 acres in the Daniel Boone National Forest. The couple, I'll call them Dan and Gina, had an off-grid cabin that Dan had built. There was a cleared-out space for the home site, and Gina grew all of their veggies and fruit. The main property was bordered or divided by a very clear creek that flowed down from a cave further up the property. It was so clear that you could safely drink from it. Gina's gardens were magical. I'm including the only picture I have from that time. After a very long drive to get there, my boyfriend and I got out. I met Dan and Gina, and she gave me a tour of the gardens. Everything was lush, there were bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds everywhere, and the place just felt sacred. They were true stewards of this land. As Gina was showing me a line of crops right near the tree line, I was distracted by a huge insect flying around me on my right side. I kept seeing it in my peripheral view, darting towards me and then away. I'm not afraid of bees, but this one was really persistent and seemed large. I turned to look, and my mouth fell open in shock. There, hovering at my shoulder, was a tiny little man. He had inky black hair and pointed ears, and his clothing looked almost like it was made of deep green leaves. His wings went really fast and sounded like a hummingbird's. I had to blink a few times because I was sure it was drive fatigue. And then he put his hands up near his ears, wiggled his fingers, and blew a raspberry at me, flying off. I turned to look at Gina. I had just met her and didn't want her to think that I was a nut. She saw my face, and she giggled. Then she said, in the sweetest Kentucky accent, "Did you see one of our fairies? They must like you. You'll get to see the fairy lights tonight and the rings tomorrow morning." I was still kind of in a state of disbelief. Despite all the weird stuff I'd seen in my life, I had never seen fairies, gnomes, or any other similar magical folk. That night, we sat on the front porch, surrounded by trees full of perfumed flowers, listening to the sounds of the forest. I remember Gina tapping my arm and pointing out to the far end of the cleared yard. There were tiny lights in the grass. Not like fireflies. These held a steady glow and moved up into the air, then down, then up, and repeated. This went on for at least an hour. We watched in silence. It felt like we were in a magic bubble. That night, my boyfriend and I camped outside in a tent. I slept deeply and woke early, before anyone else. I tiptoed outside, walking barefoot in the grass. I remember the feeling of dew on my feet. And as I walked around, I saw 3 different circles in the grass. Perfect imprints, where the grass was flattened down in a circle. The rest of my visit included a lot of incredible experiences, including getting to know Dan and Gina and enjoying being in an off-grid paradise. We hiked up to the cave and wandered towards its deep back, where there were many petroglyphs left by tribes a long time ago. Dan told us that if you went at night, you could hear drumming and chanting in the caves, but we didn't go back. I felt like it was almost trespassing, as though hundreds of eyes were on us. I just had such a feeling of reverence while on that land. Many years later, I think about them and wonder if they still live there, tending the land and protecting the magical folk. About 11 years ago, when I was 16, my family and friends went on an ATV trip to the Northwoods in Wisconsin, somewhere in Iron County, Wisconsin. We went on yearly trips where we would ride all day but head back to the same camp at night. This particular trip was our first time in the area, so we found a good-looking campground, made camp, and then went riding. The trails in this area were not all that exciting, gravel logging roads that stretched miles with no one on them, so we cut the day short, headed back to camp, and decided we would pack up camp and move the next morning to a camp group with better trails. Night came, and my dad and stepmother slept in a small cabin, while my two friends, my stepbrother, and I slept in a tent. It had been dark for a while, and we weren't getting any sleep, so we decided to take a walk around the campsite. The campground was almost at capacity, but no one was out at their fires, and it seemed like everyone was asleep. We walked the entire campground and were almost back to our tent, so we decided to stop and stare at the stars. We are from the Chicagoland area and have a lot of light pollution, so the stars that far north are very impressive. As we sat there, pointing at the stars and constellations with our low-quality flashlights, I noticed a satellite slowly moving across the sky. It was moving in a straight path across the sky, and I pointed it out and followed it with a flashlight until everyone saw it. It reached the center of the sky with its path when suddenly a large white light illuminated myself and the three others. We stood there, still staring up at the sky, in awe of what was happening. I don't remember any of us talking or questioning the light, and I also can't tell exactly how much time passed underneath the light. When the light stopped shining and our eyes were still towards the sky, we saw the same satellite dart across the sky in its same path. Stress on the word dart, as the object moved about 10 times faster than before when I first noticed it. All four of us looked at each other, shocked at what just happened, and immediately went back to camp. We talked about what it could have been and what could have happened, but we never came to any conclusion other than that it was a UFO. The next day, we told my parents about the encounter and moved on to the next campsite, business as usual. For a few years, I completely forgot about the event, which is strange in its own sense. However, to this day, all four of us remember the strange encounter with the bright light.